It was 6:47 inches the morning when my phone rang. I remember the exact time because I had just set my coffee mug down and the sound made me jump. I didn't recognize the number, but something in my stomach told me to answer it. "Is this Rachel?" a woman's voice asked. She sounded older, maybe 60, and slightly out of breath. "Yes," I said. "My name is Dorothy Haynes. I live at 4412 Briarwood Circle. I have an elderly man sitting on your front steps. He's been there since about 6:15. He has a small bag with him, and he's in his pajamas. I knocked on your door, but no one answered, and I didn't want to leave him alone." I was already moving toward my front window before she finished the sentence. My grandfather was sitting on the concrete steps of my small rental house in a thin cotton robe and leather slippers. It was 41 degrees. His white hair was flat against his head from the cold, and he was holding a plastic grocery bag on his lap with both hands, like someone might try to take it from him. He was looking at the ground. I don't know how long I stood at that window. Maybe 3 seconds, maybe 10. Then I ran. "Grandpa." I pushed through the front door and crouched in front of him. His hands were cold when I grabbed them. Not just cool, genuinely cold. The kind of cold that takes time to settle into a person. "How long have you been out here?" He looked up at me and smiled the way he always does. That slow, gentle smile that has made me feel safe my entire life. "I didn't want to ring the bell too early," he said. "I know you like to sleep in on Saturdays." I had to press my lips together hard to keep from crying in front of him. He was 84 years old. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam. He had built the house my mother grew up in with his own hands. He had taught me how to change a tire in a parking lot when I was 16, and how to make his mother's biscuit recipe, and how to balance a checkbook when every other adult in my life assumed I'd figure it out eventually. He had never once in my entire life asked for anything. And someone had dropped him on my steps in his pajamas in 41-degree weather and driven away. I got him inside. I got a blanket around him, and his hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and I sat across from him on the coffee table. So I was at his level, and I asked him, as calmly as I could, what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your uncle said the situation at the house had changed. He said it would be better if I stayed somewhere else for a while." "What situation?" "He didn't say exactly." "Did he call me first? Did he ask if I could take you?" My grandfather looked down at the mug. "He said he had spoken to you." My uncle had not spoken to me. My uncle had not called me, texted me, emailed me, or sent any communication of any kind. I had not spoken to my uncle in 6 weeks, and the last time we had spoken it was at my grandfather's birthday dinner, and my uncle had spent most of it on his phone. I asked my grandfather to stay on the couch and keep the blanket around him. I went to the kitchen and called my uncle. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Same result. I texted, "I have Grandpa here. He was on my porch in 41-degree weather in his pajamas. Call me immediately." Then, I sat down at my kitchen table and tried to think clearly, which was difficult because my hands were shaking. My grandfather had moved in with my uncle's family 14 months earlier. My grandfather's wife, my grandmother, had passed away 2 years before that, and after she died, he had stayed in their house alone for about 8 months. But he had started having small falls, nothing serious, and his doctor had recommended he not live alone. My mother had passed away when I was 19. It was just my uncle on that side of the family, and my uncle had a big house, and my uncle had volunteered. I had been grateful at the time. I was 27 when my grandfather moved in with my uncle, and I was renting a 1-bedroom apartment and working as a 2nd-grade teacher, and the idea that my grandfather was in a home with a spare room and people around had felt like a relief. I had visited once a month. I had called every week. When I visited, things had seemed fine. My grandfather seemed comfortable. My uncle's wife was polite to him in the way someone is polite to a guest they've stopped noticing. What I hadn't known, what I was about to spend the next several weeks learning, was that the situation inside that house had nothing to do with comfort. My uncle called me back at 9:43 that morning. He was getting harder to manage, my uncle said. He said it the way someone says a thing they've rehearsed. Flat, prepared. My wife and I talked about it, and we decided it would be better for him to be with younger family. "You dropped him on my porch at 6 in the morning without calling me. I texted you last week. You did not text me last week." There was a pause. "Well, I thought I did. Look, Rachel, it's not a big deal. He's fine. You have a house now. It makes more sense. He was in his pajamas in 41-degree weather. He must have changed after we left. He does things like that now. That was the first time I heard that phrasing. He does things like that now. My uncle used it 3 more times in that conversation. Each time I asked a specific question. Why didn't you call me? Why didn't he have real clothes? Why was there only one bag? My uncle redirected to some version of my grandfather's declining competence. He was forgetful. He got confused. He did things like that now. My grandfather, sitting 20 feet away from me on my couch, reading a Field and Stream magazine he had found on my bookshelf, was completely lucid. He remembered the name of the neighbor who had called me. He remembered that he had not eaten breakfast. He told me later that day, without any prompting, exactly how much was in his checking account, or rather, exactly how much he believed was in his checking account, which turned out to be very different from the reality. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I did not decide to fight this battle because of money. I want to say that plainly, and I want to say it once. I was a 29-year-old teacher. I rented a 2-bedroom house because I had been hoping to get a roommate, and instead, I ended up with my grandfather, which was not a hardship. My grandfather was not a hardship. He was the person I called when I didn't know what to do. He was the person who had shown up with a casserole and stayed for a week when I went through a difficult breakup at 24. He was the reason I became a teacher, because I had watched him spend 3 decades volunteering in his community, and I had understood from that watching that the most valuable thing a person could do was show up consistently for people who needed them. The money mattered because it was his. He had earned it. He had saved it. And someone had taken it. Here is what I found out over the course of the following 2 weeks. My grandfather received a veteran's pension of $1,340 per month and a Social Security payment of $1,190 per month. Combined, that was $2,530 a month, $30,360 a year. In the 14 months he had lived with my uncle, not a single cent of that income had gone into my grandfather's personal account. My uncle had set up a joint account with my grandfather 11 months earlier. My grandfather thought it was for convenience, and every direct deposit had been redirected there. My uncle had full access. My grandfather had not used an ATM or written a personal check in 11 months. Additionally, my grandfather had approximately $47,000 in a savings account that had existed since before my grandmother died. That account had $4,200 left in it. I found all of this out with my grandfather's help. He gave me permission to call his bank. He sat next to me at my kitchen table and answered the security questions himself. And when the banker on the phone read back the account history, my grandfather went very quiet for a long time. I thought the money was going to household expenses, he finally said. Your uncle said it was going to household expenses. Did he show you receipts? He looked at his hands. No. I kept my voice steady. I told him it was okay. I told him we were going to figure it out. And then I went to my bedroom, closed the door, and stayed there for about 10 minutes doing something I hadn't done since my mother's funeral. After that, I made a list. The first call I made was to Adult Protective Services. I want to say this clearly for anyone who has ever been in a similar situation. This should be the first call. Not a family conversation. Not a second chance for the person who did this. Adult Protective Services. I called them the same afternoon I found out about the accounts, and I told them everything I knew, and they opened a case that same day. The second call I made was to an elder law attorney. Her name was Patricia, and she had an office 40 minutes from my house, and she had a calm, no-nonsense manner that I found deeply reassuring. I told her the whole story in approximately 30 minutes. She asked me several questions. Then she said, "What you're describing is financial elder abuse. That's not a civil matter. That's a crime." I had suspected this. Hearing it said out loud in that flat, professional tone made it real in a different way. "We need to document everything," Patricia said. "Bank records, his income history, any communications your uncle sent you. Do you have anything in writing?" I had the text messages my uncle had sent over the past 14 months. Most of them were brief updates about my grandfather's health, requests that I not visit on certain weekends because of family plans, one message from 6 months ago that said my grandfather had started a new medication and might seem off when I called. That one sat differently now that I was reading it again. I also had something my uncle didn't know about. 3 months earlier, I had called my grandfather on a Sunday afternoon, and during the conversation he had mentioned, almost in passing, that he felt like he had less money than he should. He hadn't been alarmed. He was almost apologetic about it, like he was embarrassed to bring it up. I had been concerned enough that I had recorded the rest of that conversation. I don't know exactly why. Something in his voice. Something that didn't sit right. In that recording, my grandfather said, "Your uncle manages all of that for me now. He said it was easier. I used to like knowing what I had. I feel a little lost without that." I sent that recording to Patricia that night. What happened over the following 6 weeks was not fast, and it was not simple, and there were days when it felt like nothing was moving. My uncle called me twice. The first time, he told me I was causing unnecessary family drama. He said my grandfather was forgetful and that he had been generously housing him for over a year, and that I had no idea what that was like. He said the expenses had been real and that he had documentation if I needed it. The second time, he didn't bother with the calm approach. He told me that if I continued down this road, I would regret it, and that my grandfather would regret it too, because there were people in this family who could make things complicated. I saved both voicemails and forwarded them to Patricia. I also saved the voicemail my uncle's wife left me, the one where she described my grandfather as not all there and suggested that he had probably agreed to the financial arrangements without understanding them, which she seemed to believe was a defense rather than an admission. The Adult Protective Services investigation moved on its own timeline. A caseworker named Jerome came to my house twice and spoke with my grandfather directly, without me in the room, which I respected. My grandfather was consistent, clear, and specific both times. He told Jerome that he had not understood the account arrangement to mean that his money would be spent without his knowledge. He told Jerome that he had asked my uncle twice about the savings account balance and been told it was fine. He said he had been hesitant to push further because he didn't want to seem ungrateful. That word, ungrateful, stayed with me. My 84-year-old grandfather, who had earned every dollar of that money over a lifetime of work and service, had been hesitant to ask where his own money was because he didn't want to seem ungrateful. In the 4th week, the bank fraud department completed their own review. The findings were significant enough that they referred the matter to the district attorney's office without being asked. Patricia told me this was a good sign. I did not feel good. I felt tired and sad, and very aware that this was not a story about my uncle being a stranger. This was my father's brother, the man who had been at every Thanksgiving and Christmas and 4th of July for my entire life, the man my grandfather had trusted with his home and his accounts, and the last years of his life. My grandfather handled all of it with more grace than I could have managed. He asked me questions about the process carefully and listened to the answers. He never said anything bitter about my uncle. Once, when I was frustrated after a long phone call with Patricia and I said something sharp about what my uncle deserved, my grandfather looked at me steadily and said, "Don't let anger make you someone you don't want to be." I didn't say anything sharp after that. What I did do was document everything. Every call, every date, every conversation. I kept a notebook on my kitchen counter and wrote things down the moment they happened. Patricia told me later that this notebook was one of the most useful pieces of evidence we had, not because of any single entry, but because the consistency and detail of it made it credible in a way that was hard to argue with. My grandfather also, in the 5th week, remembered something he hadn't thought to mention earlier. Before my grandmother died, they had updated their estate documents together. He had named my uncle as his primary financial power of attorney, but he had also named a secondary someone to step in if the primary was unable or unwilling to act in his best interest. He had named me. He hadn't told me at the time because, as he put it, he hoped it would never be relevant. He pulled the documents out of the plastic grocery bag he had arrived with, the same bag he had been holding on my front steps that first morning, and slid them across the kitchen table to me. I stared at the papers for a long moment. Then I called Patricia. The power of attorney document changed the legal picture considerably. Combined with the bank records, the APS investigation, the voicemails, and the recorded phone call, Patricia said we had a strong case on multiple fronts: the civil recovery of misappropriated funds, the revocation of my uncle's financial authority, and the support of the DA's criminal investigation. The court date for the civil proceedings was 6 weeks after I had found my grandfather on my front steps. I took the day off from school. My grandfather wore the navy suit he had worn to my grandmother's funeral, and he looked dignified and calm and a little thin. And when we walked into the courthouse together, he held the door for an older woman behind us out of pure habit, and I had to look away for a second. The judge reviewed the documentation. Patricia presented the bank records, the power of attorney, the APS findings, and the recording. My uncle's attorney argued that the expenses had been legitimate, that the costs of housing and caring for an elderly man were substantial, and that my uncle had acted in good faith. The judge asked my uncle's attorney to provide an itemized accounting of how $43,000 in savings and 14 months of pension and Social Security income had been spent on my grandfather's care. My uncle's attorney could not provide that accounting. The judge ruled that my uncle's financial authority was revoked immediately. He ordered a full repayment of funds that could not be accounted for. He referred the matter formally to the DA's office and noted in his ruling that the evidence presented was consistent with financial exploitation of a protected adult. 2 weeks after the civil ruling, my uncle was charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. That is a felony in our state. I found out from Patricia on a Thursday morning. I was at school, between classes, standing in the hallway outside my classroom with the second graders doing silent reading inside, and I read her text twice, and then stood there for a minute, looking at the kids through the window in my door. One of them had his book upside down and was clearly pretending to read. Another one had fallen asleep with her cheek on her desk. I thought about my grandfather and how long he had been quietly confused about where his money was going. Too considerate to demand an explanation. Trusting a person who did not deserve trust. I went back into the classroom. I righted the upside-down book without saying anything and moved on. My grandfather had a follow-up appointment with his doctor that week. His first with me as his accompanying support person, rather than my uncle. The doctor's notes from my uncle's tenure showed that my uncle had repeatedly described my grandfather as showing signs of cognitive decline. The doctor told me, with some care, that he had not personally observed those signs to the degree my uncle had described them, but that he had taken a family member's account at face value. My grandfather's cognitive assessment that day came back normal for his age, not diminished normal. Oriented, communicative, precise about dates and details. He remembered the names of both my second-grade teaching assistants, whom he had met exactly once, at a school event 3 months before. He had not been declining. He had been managed. I moved my grandmother's rocking chair from storage into the corner of my living room. My grandfather sits in it in the evenings and reads, and sometimes we watch old westerns, which he likes, and sometimes we just sit together and I grade papers while he does a crossword puzzle. And it is the most ordinary thing in the world, and also one of the best things in my life. The first pension deposit that went into his restored personal account, the one in his name only, that only he controlled, with me listed simply as emergency contact, arrived on the 14th of the month. He checked his balance online with me sitting next to him, and he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "That's what it should be." 3 weeks after the criminal charges were filed, my uncle showed up at my house. It was a Sunday afternoon. I saw the car from the kitchen window, and I felt something go very still and very clear inside me, the way it does when you've been preparing for something for a long time, and it finally arrives. I did not open the door. My uncle knocked, then knocked again, then rang the doorbell twice, then knocked again with both hands. The kind of knocking that you can hear from anywhere in the house, urgent and demanding, like he was owed entry. My grandfather looked up from his crossword puzzle. "Is that your uncle?" "Yes," I said. He went back to his crossword puzzle. My uncle knocked for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. He called my name twice through the door. He called my grandfather's name once. At some point he stopped knocking and stood on the porch for a few minutes, and then I heard his footsteps going back down the steps and his car door and the sound of him pulling away. He left no note. He sent no text. I went back to the kitchen and poured myself more coffee. My grandfather had finished his crossword puzzle and moved on to the Sudoku. "You handled that well," he said, without looking up. I learned from you, I said. He smiled at the Sudoku. I taught you better than I knew. There is something I want to say to anyone who finds themselves in a situation like this one, because I have thought about it a lot in the months since and I believe it matters. The instinct when someone you love is being harmed by family is to handle it quietly, to have conversations first, to give chances, to protect everyone's dignity by keeping it private. I understand that instinct completely. I felt it myself. In the first week, part of me wanted to call my uncle and say, "Give the money back, agree to some arrangement, we won't involve anyone else." I am glad I didn't. Financial abuse of an elderly person is a crime. It doesn't become less of a crime because the person who did it is your uncle, or your parent, or your sibling. It doesn't become less of a crime because the victim is gentle and doesn't want to cause trouble. The gentle ones. The ones who are too considerate to demand explanations, they are exactly the people these protections exist for. Call Adult Protective Services. Call an elder law attorney. Document everything from the moment you suspect something is wrong. The systems exist. Use them. My grandfather turns 85 next month. He has asked for a specific kind of chocolate cake that my grandmother used to make, and he has written the recipe down on an index card and propped it on my kitchen counter where I'll see it every morning. I have been practicing it on weekends. His pension and Social Security go into his personal account every month. His savings, partially restored through the civil judgment, and currently the subject of an ongoing restitution order, grow a little each month. He has a financial advisor now. Patricia recommended someone and he meets with her every quarter and understands everything that is happening with his money, and he likes that. He always liked knowing what he had. He told me that again recently. He told me something else recently. Late on a weeknight when we were both still awake, him in my grandmother's rocking chair, and me on the couch with ungraded spelling tests on my lap. He said he was sorry that I had to go through all of it. I told him I wasn't sorry at all, he said. I was afraid, you know. Before you opened the door that morning, I was sitting on those steps, and I wasn't sure you would want me. I put down the spelling tests. I looked at him for a moment. Grandpa, I said. There is no version of any morning where I would not have opened that door. He nodded slowly, the way he does when something lands somewhere real. I know that now, he said.